He had his gun, so he just swung it open.
I start to notice that, the atmosphere feels a little bit weird.
First thing he seen was this 6.5 foot tall, broad shoulder, dark hair. That freaked him out.
We hadn't talked to her about like life and death and what any of that means. She's 3 years old,
So we turned around. Suddenly there's a whole tree falling across the road.
And she was describing to us that, there was a deceased person that she could see visually.
You're listening to Cryptid Clues, where we tackle the ever-expanding history and mystery of monsters and supernatural madness every Monday. You can find us at CryptidClues.ca for more information, or even check out exclusive content and support us at patreon.com/CryptidClues.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to another episode of Cryptid Clues. I am your host, Taylor, and today I wanted to continue the discussion of the paranormal as we get closer to Halloween. So in the past, we've discussed hotspots, encounters, and even the post-event hauntings that can all take place, but the idea of today's topic is in reference to the horrific storms that are just slamming the United States right now. It made me think that potentially a storm that was powerful enough could maybe have real-life implications with its energy output. Before we get into all that, though, be sure to check us out at CryptidClues.ca, our social media channels, and if you wish to reach us directly, you can do so via CryptidClues@gmail.com. Now, if you missed last week's episode, go check that out. Reuben leads us on a lucid path of dream discussion. It is a fantastic time. And it's funny because in retrospect, I've had a few people that have just brought it up in conversation. And I think, you know what? The timing of this is impeccable because we just did an episode on lucid dreaming. So go check it out. It's available on all of our feeds. It's a great time. But with all that said and done, let's talk about hurricane storms and the paranormal. So to start us off here, we're going to get the science book out. Hurricanes. They are a combination of two key ingredients. The first is warm ocean water, and the second is moist, humid air. Now, when this humid air is flowing in an upward direction towards a zone of low pressure, we have simultaneously above warm ocean water. So basically, the water is then released from the air, which quickly begins to form these storm clouds. And as it's rising, the air will start to rotate, which ultimately forms the hurricane. Now, once this hurricane has gotten its momentum, it's then broken down into three different parts. There's the rain bands on its outer edges, there's the eye, and then there's the eye wall. Now, the cloud-free eye in the very center of the storm, that's when the air starts to sink after it spirals in towards the center in a counterclockwise pattern. And when it shoots out the top, it does so in the opposite direction. The outer edge rain bands, they're made up of dense bands of thunderstorms that can range from a few miles to over 300 miles long. It's pretty crazy how far out these can go. Now, the thunderstorms, they stir energy in the atmosphere. And according to those who research paranormal activity, this type of energy may stir such manifestations. And I quote, "There are lots of people who witness hauntings, who have homes they claim are haunted, who will tell us that when you have something such as a thunderstorm, they do have an increase in activity." End quote. That's from the Pennsylvania Paranormal Association director, Mark Keyes. Now, Mark Keyes used to be a police officer until he retired. And while he always had an interest in paranormal occurrences, he eventually founded a group to further investigate these things as other law enforcement officials started to discuss certain ongoings with him. Now, what Keyes believes, in accordance with his research, is that if a spirit is trying to manifest itself, actually become physically visible, it will need to pull out energy from the environment to do just that. And this could include heat, as cold spots are commonly reported as well in areas where hauntings are reported. Keyes mentions that shortly after a lightning storm, activity increases. And I quote, "Our psychic medium and this seems to be pretty common with most mediums, will say that after a thunderstorm, or if there's a moon cycle or different times of the year, they are witnessing physically a lot more activity, end quote. I found a case from a bit ago where during a thunderstorm, the residents noticed an increase in activity themselves as well. Their apartment had been home to them for about 6 years, and after having a baby, one night they were up very, very late, which also coincided with a storm that was forming outside. Now, things started to get a little crazy around 11 p.m. at night. A few hours later, the parents started to hear what sounded like hooves walking around their kitchen, followed by growl laughter. Now, what the importance of the situation here is that they claim this was not the first time that this type of occurrence had happened, but that during storms, they encountered it exceptionally more frequently. This leads us to our next encounter. So, I'm fairly certain my house is haunted. My partner and I frequently catch glimpses of shadows from the corners of our vision and hear strange noises and even voices. But I've never experienced so many occurrences at once. If spirits can tap into electrical energy, is it possible they could harness the power of a storm to manifest as well? One evening, I found myself sitting alone in my office, enveloped in silence. The house was empty, and the neighbors weren't home either. Living in such a quiet area, I knew that any sound I heard couldn't have come from outside, especially since all the windows and doors were closed. Suddenly, I heard footsteps coming down the stairs, followed by 3 distinct thuds as if someone was walking on the hard floor below. I brushed it off at first, but after about a minute, I heard the same 3 footsteps again, accompanied by a loud bang from downstairs. That's when I decided to investigate. I stepped into the living room, but everything seemed normal. And as I turned to head back into the hallway, I spotted a shimmering white silver mist at the bottom of the stairs. It hovered there for about 3 seconds before disappearing right before my eyes. It was roughly a foot wide and about 2 feet tall. I returned to my office and settled back in, but just a few minutes later, an overpowering rotten smell hit me out of nowhere. It was reminiscent of a clogged drain mixed with burnt rubber, definitely unpleasant. And the odor lingered for only a second or two and vanished as quickly as it arrived. I looked around for a source, but there was no explanation, especially with all the windows shut. I tried not to dwell on it, and shortly after, my partner came home from work. Within 30 seconds of entering, he set his thermos, a reliable item that he's used for over a year, down on the kitchen counter. And suddenly, it just exploded. The lid flew across the room and water just went everywhere. There was nothing in it except just plain tap water. I couldn't make sense of it. This wasn't the first strange incident, though. Last year, a regular pint of glass water shattered out of nowhere, and I still have no idea how that happened. Then about 10 minutes later, a massive thunderstorm rolled in, lasting a good hour. The storms like that are quite rare in our area, and it made me wonder if the spirit could somehow influence all these events by drawing energy from that storm. Since then, aside from the occasional fleeting shadow, everything has been eerily quiet. So now in retrospect here, this story has pre-storm occurrences, but it's the energy in the air, I would say, the buildup. And it's kind of like animals have that pre-existing insight and that feeling, that sixth sense where, okay, we know something bad's going to happen, and they bounce. And it's something that humans, maybe we had at one point, but I think we've kind of detached ourselves from nature in that front. So that's a topic for another day. But I think that if there was something paranormal going on here, that just because the storm hasn't landed yet, does not necessarily mean that the energy hasn't already hit the area. There's already looming, especially if we know animals can detect when things are going on and they can leave before the actual event hits, right? That pre-existing kind of factor is what I'm examining here and looking at it. So the storm hits a place that it shouldn't be hitting often. That's another interesting fact too, because you have these ongoings happening more frequently. You notice it becoming more prominent. I see it as a form of deduction. So we know that the storm hits, it's rare. All of a sudden we have more frequent occurrences. And so we're kind of trying to eliminate, process of elimination. Is that what I'm trying to say here? I guess we're just looking at all the ingredients involved and deducing what the possible result could be. But of course, if we wanted to be factual in this, it's it's tricky. It's a little bit harder to run with that, even though it may look like logical sense. But let's expand on this a little bit more. Let's suppose that energy from storms does officially supercharge ghosts. Could we then include more atmospheric events like solar activity, geomagnetic storms? A great example of this could be the northern lights that we've been having very recently, more frequently too, I might add, which is interesting. It seems like this is frequently occurring. Like we didn't have it happen too long ago. That's when if you're not sure, you look up at the sky and you can see the northern lights. It's purple, it's green. Everyone's posting it all over the interwebs lately when it happens. But I digress. Such powerful energy. This isn't obviously isolated to small locations, as we saw with the Northern Lights. This is everywhere across North America. People are photographing it and sharing it. So if that amount of energy that is coming out from the sun has just been cast out over the entire continent, I'm not talking about the severity of Ghostbusters, where ghosts are running rampant over the city. I see this as, again, it's a large area, but we're not dealing with ghosts going crazy everywhere. I think that we're just dealing with a few prominent locations where these areas have old buildings, couple of them, one or two, and those old buildings that have history there, a lot of negative energy, probably have more frequent things taking place when a storm like this hits. Of course, I can't speak to it being factual. It's different because when you're dealing with a hurricane or a thunderstorm, it's a little bit more close to home and close to the ground, and so maybe that energy is a lot more concentrated. But we can't necessarily just discount and disregard the idea that maybe the energy is still just as powerful if this is an atmospheric event as well. So in connection with this, what if the electromagnetic activity of a storm is somehow just amplifying one's alertness and cortical activity? Maybe that's all it is, and it's not necessarily just making ghosts pop up more often. It's actually affecting us. It is established that weak and moderate geomagnetic storms actually will exert stimulating influences, while the stronger ones will activate inhibiting processes. So, for example, investigations examined a patient's blood, and the blood viscosity during geomagnetic storms increased sharply, in some cases almost twice. The bloodstream started to slow down, and the red blood cells almost started to become like an adhesive, therefore demonstrating that magnetic storms can increase the risk of morbidity in the cardiovascular system. Fun fact as well, astronauts that are actually orbiting in space can be subject to cardiac rhythms problems, when faced with geomagnetic storms. Now, all that information was sourced from a research journal from the Centro Nacional de Investigación Científicas, Cuba, back in 2005. It's an 8-page read if you want to investigate it further. I've included a link to this report in the description below, so definitely take a little gander at that if you like. So, too much storm, it's bad. Just a little bit, not ideal, but it can have certain effects on us. Ultimately, it could be possible that these hurricanes and storms have absolutely no direct paranormal effect. In the words of another that I'm paraphrasing here, the belief could stem from how often such stormy weather instinctively increases a survival mode. So when certain things happen, maybe our quick survival mode reaction is to think, oh wow, ghost. But that's just be playing devil's advocate. Ultimately, my thoughts. I've always believed that you have hotspots of paranormal activity. Energy is very, very important. It's a major factor on this planet, and it's a big thing with us as much as we kind of cut it off and disregard it. If you concentrate those spots with a reinforcement of energy, I no doubt in my mind, you're going to get unpredictable results, especially more so with things that potentially feed off that energy. And I don't mean that all as negative. Now, some things are just stagnant, wandering for who knows what. And then you have the other things that wander, not necessarily stagnant, but they feed off of what we have. You can call it a soul, call it a life, call it whatever you like or believe. Could even be this energy. But I believe that as we live on this planet, there is something that shadows us, and if you aren't careful, we'll always look for a way in. In closing, I have one more experience to share. Now, this individual back in the day was on a family trip throughout the summer to check out many of the Civil War battlefields. After arriving at their first destination, it was already raining something fierce here. So the family had set up their tents whilst the rain was actually driving almost everyone else out of the campgrounds. They just couldn't handle it anymore. But while young at the time, he and his sister were sharing one tent and his parents in the other, when suddenly you could hear the gunshots go off, followed by these loud booms. So note, this is happening at night. Now, the following day, the family discussed together the sounds that they had all heard. Well, the parents mentioned that they also heard voices in addition to the gunfire, and they all brought this to the attention of the campground owner. The owner reinforced what they heard and told them that the campground was actually built in an area where soldiers had initially set up tents, and others that had stayed here were also hearing gunfire and voices as well. But in particular, this type of activity became much more frequent during and after storms, and that's what the campground owner had said to them. So it actually really, really blew my mind in closing here, when I was thinking about topics, and I was thinking about, the implications that a storm could have on paranormal. And when I looked online, I thought, wow, there is a lot of other people thinking the same thing. A lot of people that are having these discussions online about how storms have effects on the paranormal. And it's fascinating to see that the community is really, really rallying behind this and having these discussions, because it's a random thought. Some of these episode topics that come into my mind, it's like, oh, you know what? I don't know if anyone's talked about this. Let's explore it. Let's see what we're doing and what we're dealing with here, and pull out different facts and research and kind of compile it into an episode and share it with you guys. And I thought that would probably be the same thing here, because paranormal hurricanes, this just seems like a zany kind of thing to combine. Usually it's the fallout after a destructive event, like we've talked about tsunamis, and then the people that have passed away, and then people that after they rebuild certain parts of towns, they see things, and just the post scenarios we've discussed a lot. But the pre and during a storm, I just thought that would just be a uncommon thing. But the fact that it is very common makes me wonder, and this is something that I definitely want to build off of, because there are some places in the world that are naturally more spiritually connected, and it's fascinating to know that those places possibly too suffer from a lot more storm activity as well. So it's one of those things where maybe you can connect the dots, and maybe you can start to see a pattern. Of course, I'm not speaking on fact when I say that. It's all just taken with a grain of salt. But I'm curious what you guys all think. Do you reckon that storms have any effect on the paranormal? Is it all mumbo jumbo? Do you think that maybe it's just us getting zapped and thinking extra like, oh my gosh, there's something in my house, because you're just on edge? When a storm hits, things can feel oddly quiet and silent, because it's almost like it's just the cloud canopy up above cushioning all the sounds. I don't know how the acoustics properly work in a storm, but it just feels like there's a little bit of a silence when you walk out, and it's just blasting wind out there, or just it's calm before the storm. But I'm just babbling now, so I'm going to wrap this episode up. I hope you enjoyed it. There's going to be a couple more paranormal spooky episodes dropping as we get closer to Halloween. So until next time, everyone, remember, you can tune in to our website, CryptidClues.ca. Find us on our socials, X, YouTube, and Facebook. And if you want to reach out, send us a message or your thoughts, CryptidClues@gmail.com. All right, everyone, take care and stay safe.